Possibly. There we go. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Stevenson. As always, I appreciate the invite. I appreciate everybody being here today as well. Looking forward to today's programming and have enjoyed seeing most all of y'all previously throughout the weeks we've been doing this. And Dr. Stevenson has been kind enough to invite me to join him throughout the weeks. The past couple times I've talked a little bit about some establishing and IDing the different types of turf grasses, and we've talked a little bit about some fertilizer and some soil test interpretation. So this week I thought we would kind of look at maybe some disease issues, some fungal, bacteria, a couple of different things that we got going on. Now it's kind of an active time for diseases. I'm starting to see quite a bit of it kind of pop up here and there. So, you know, the good thing about it is this time of year, we're basically at the beginning of the growing season. So once the conditions change, kind of everything's going to kind of grow back for the most part. And then we'll see this again. We'll have this again, unfortunately, in the fall. September, October, when conditions are kind of back like they are now. So typically our springs are a little moister than our fall, so we get a little bit more rainfall. So we have a little bit higher disease tendency this time of year than we do in the fall, but we do have the temperatures, and we can kind of create some of the issues with watering a little bit too much or running irrigation or things like that in the fall. So we can kind of create that same environment that we're seeing now. So we're starting here in southeast Mississippi in Lamar County. We're kind of drying up a little bit. We had a little bit of a rain last Wednesday, I believe it was. So hadn't had any since. So we're starting to kind of teeter on that edge of drying out a little bit to kind of put a damper on some of the disease activity. But just want to kind of go over today, just kind of identify a couple of them and basically just manage lawn diseases, because it's something that we're always going to have to deal with. It's something that we're always going to have. There's really no way of controlling it. It's just we're going to manage for it. We're going to limit it, the amount of damage it does. We're going to try to prevent it from spreading worse than it already is, some things like that. So we're just going to kind of talk about the conditions each one kind of likes, which they're all basically the same, but some of the identifying characteristics, some of the signs and symptoms, and just some things like that. So we'll go ahead and get started. So first we kind of need to know what a disease is. Basically, it's an impairment to the normal state of the plant that interrupts or modifies its vital functions. So just like in humans, a disease is anything that basically keeps us from our bodies or the plant from doing the process as it normally does correctly. So we do have quite a variety of different types of diseases. There are two things that cause disease. These are abiotic and biotic. Abiotic are basically non-living things that cause issues within the plant. So these things include nutrient deficiencies, our watering practices, pesticide exposure, traffic, just foot traffic, things like that. Things that we do that tend to cause issues, or shade, things like that. So, and then the biotic are the living things that cause issues or disease within the plant. This can include fungi, bacteria, viruses, nematodes, phytoplasmas, things like this. So today we're basically going to be looking at fungi. That's really kind of what gives the most issues with turf grasses, or the fungi. We do see some viruses in some various different species of turf, but not typically. So we're going to basically look at some fungi today. But to have a problem or to have a disease outbreak, you got to have three things. That's why we look at this as a disease triangle. We have to have, for the disease to be prevalent, you have to have a favorable environment. You have to have the pathogen itself, and you have to have a susceptible host. So basically, there's only one of those legs we can typically, in a turf grass situation, that we can kind of control, and that's the environment. We're always going to have the pathogen, and basically, once we select a turf grass, we're kind of out of luck on selecting a less susceptible host. Now, again, there are a couple of turf grasses that are more susceptible, but again, we're kind of limited on what we can choose. There's not like typically not as much selection as there are in like vegetable plants and ornamental plants for disease resistance. So you don't see like in tomatoes, you select for a variety that's resistant to different pathogens or different diseases. And you don't really see that too much in turf grass, unfortunately. But so we need to kind of know what the difference is and what we're looking at when we're seeing diseases. Basically, when there are signs and symptoms. So basically, the sign is any portion of the pathogen or its products. So a sign is an actual part of the disease or the pathogen. So anything you can see from mycelium to spores that are on the plant or on the leaf, or in the case of a vegetable or something like that, something on the fruit itself, those are actual signs. So symptoms, on the other hand, are the response of the plant to the pathogen. So this can include some tumors or galls or stunning, kind of deformed growth, rosetting, things like that. That can that's the actual plant's response because of the disease infection. So kind of a little bit of difference between the signs and the symptoms. You got some chlorosis and necrosis that can cause a little mosaic where it's kind of speckled, kind of have spots on it, kind of a little bit different thing. So just knowing those two differences and what you're looking at, whether it's a sign of the pathogen or a symptom of the disease. So again, the symptoms are the visible effects. It can be a change in color, it can be a leaf wilting, it can be a multitude of things, but just realizing what the difference is, and knowing how to kind of describe those helps tremendously when trying to figure out what exactly disease you're dealing with there, or what pathogen. So some of the abiotic problems, which again, these are man-made typically, or not caused by a living pathogen. Nutrient deficiencies, pesticide exposure. You can see the blossom end right on the tomato. That's typically caused by watering and the lack of calcium. You can see some herbicide damage here. Looks like some 2,4-D damage on the bottom, on the tomato plant at the bottom. Possibly some interveinal chlorosis on the leaf up here on the far right. So plant nutrient deficiencies can sometimes look like disease problems, but the typical difference is it's some questions you need to ask them to answer, and that may tell you whether you're dealing with a nutrient deficiency or a disease plant. So do all the symptoms affect all the plants in a given area? Are they all affected uniformly? And when did the symptoms appear? So, obviously disease is going to affect some plants, typically in some areas more so than, so it's not going to be as widespread typically as nutrient deficiency. So if you have a whole row of tomatoes that's exhibiting the same symptoms, or that may be something that is a nutrient deficiency as opposed to scattered plants throughout the area or something like that. So just something to think about, a couple of questions to ask, whether or not what you're dealing with is either a disease or a nutrient deficiency. Nutrient deficiencies and To an extent, disease issues can cause this too, typically not on this scale, but you'll see some chlorosis, which is basically just overall yellowing of the plant. That interveinal chlorosis, where the veins of the leaf or the blades of grass, whatever the plant, stay green, and then the areas outside away from the veins turn chlorotic. And then the necrosis is basically just marginal dead tissue or even in spots. So again, that can be caused by a plant disease, but more common in a nutrient deficiency, something like that. But again, we can definitely see that but it's going to be more widespread throughout kind of through the entire yard or entire area when it's a nutrient deficiency. So it won't be just like in a patch like we do mostly see most of our diseases. Overwatered and underwatered is another abiotic issue. Obviously not giving that plant root system the oxygen it needs to kind of breathe, and that can cause just as much issues as underwatering, if not more. So just drowning those roots out can cause big issues with nutrient uptake and just the plant's overall health. I see that happen a lot too, and you'll notice it on places that don't drain well, where grass doesn't grow there very well. Places that hold water, it just drowns them out. Pesticide damage, another abiotic. You can see here in these pictures, you can see something in the top left where something was sprayed and it was like a golf cart or a lawnmower or something, drove through it and then realized, oh no, I think I just made a mistake. I wasn't supposed to drive through that. So he did a U-turn real quick, and you can see his tire tracks going out through there. So obviously that doesn't look like a disease issue. Pretty easy to spot that out, as well as the one on the bottom right. You can see where it looks like they were spot spraying some weeds and got a little crazy with the trigger on their sprayer, and just kind of either had a leak or just had a little fun spraying the water. So that kind of winds up our abiotic issues, and then we're going to go into the biotic pathogens. Again, we're going to focus mostly on fungi, but these other ones are and will and can be issues at times. So a fungal disease has the possibility of being foliar, vascular. There's a wide range of diseases and fungal diseases. And a good way to identify them is through the use of spores, mycelia, or lesions. So obviously this looks like this is the mycelium, which is the large group of basically hyphae that is grouped together. The basically look like cottony material down in the bottom right that you'll see on roots or on the grass itself. Typically you find this early in the morning when it's still a little bit of dew on the ground, and obviously before the sun has come out too much to dry it out, and you'll see this mycelium much more prevalently in the morning times. So morning time is a great time to get out, and if you think you have a disease activity or disease issue, the morning is the best time to kind of get out and do some scouting and see what you've got. But you can also see here the spores on this leaf on the bottom. Some things like that are a sure tell sign of disease activity. So if you see that, you're more than likely dealing with a disease and not some type of nutrient deficiency or things like that. So just something to think about. We do get vascular fungal diseases. Again, this looks like a tobacco plant, but again, we do get these in turf grasses as well. They affect the ability of the plant to take nutrients and water from the roots up to the plants, and affect the ability of the plant's leaves to put carbohydrates and sugars, take them down to the root. So it kind of creates a roadblock within that plant to limit its ability to transfer nutrients and water. So that's how we that's how they seem to limit or damage plants. So it's kind of a widespread. It kind of happens quickly for the most part, especially in a turf grass where you're not dealing with the 3 or 4 foot tall tomato plant where it takes a while for it to kind of happen. So this can happen rather quickly on a large or on a small turf grass plant. So next, we're going to kind of start into the particular diseases that we see here in South Mississippi, throughout Mississippi for the most part. This is not a comprehensive list by any stretch of the imagination. It's just a couple of them that we more commonly see. Obviously, there are some on golf courses and in higher maintained turf grasses that we see that are not on this list, but they're not as big of an issue with homeowners, and we just don't get as many calls on them as we do as the couple that we're going to talk about and look at and just kind of figure out how to diagnose and how to treat or how to manage for. The first one is large patch, and it's also sometimes called brown patch. Large patch is called when it's infecting a warm season grass, which is typically what we see it infecting here in South Mississippi, unless it's on ryegrass or something during the winter time. And then at that point, it would be called brown patch. But the pathogen that infects and causes large patch or brown patch is Rhizoctonia solani. So it typically likes temperatures below 80 degrees. So now is why we're seeing it a lot because of that, because we're right around that 80-degree mark. Some days we're a little warmer, but those cooler nights, warmer days in the 50s and 60s at night, up to 75, 85 during the day. We have a high moisture, so we have those heavy dews in the morning. And now is a lot of times people are out there fertilizing, so that can cause some issues, getting a little too much over fertilization early in the year. Will kind of boost this pathogen's ability to infect and will make it spread a little bit faster. So kind of limiting and kind of holding off on those early spring fertilizations can help with this disease management. Just kind of getting that fertilizer out there once the risk of this disease or once the environment has changed. So again, we're trying to affect that environment more so than any other leg of that disease triangle. Homeowners do have a couple of options as far as chemical control. Again, this is management. This isn't really control, because once you get that patch out there, and this is very, very indicative of what you will see in a home loan situation. Just this picture, this kind of looks like it's got kind of scalloped edges, and this looks like it's kind of was probably at one point 2 infection points that grew. So an infection point starts in basically at one spore, and it spreads out in a circle from that one spore. So it's kind of like a drop of water hitting a pond where the waves spread out from the middle. So that looks like kind of what has happened at that location, where you can see that little bit of scalloped edge at the top, in the top center. So there was probably 2 infection points met up and just kind of coalesced together. So, and you can see a little bit more here at the very front edge of this picture, bottom edge of the picture too. When this disease is active, you will see a kind of an orangey, bright reddish, bright orange kind of edge or halo around at the active growing point of this disease on the outside edge, where that grass is, where it's feeding on that growing turf grass. The disease is no longer in the center of that patch. The disease is active along the outside edge, where it's actively infecting new turf grass and actively feeding. So if you are interested in submitting a sample, we do have samples. We can send samples of turf grass and other plants off to the lab to be tested for disease and find out exactly what you have. But you want to take half and half. So you don't want to come right in the center and get all the dead grass out. And you don't want to go over here to all where the healthy grass is. You want to get right on the edge and get like a 6-inch square, and 3 inches on one side being healthy grass and 3 inches on the other side being the diseased turf. So you want to split the difference right in the middle, as to where you have a good chance of actually catching and getting a sample of the actual pathogen itself. You test that middle section, you'll find every disease known to man in there. And you won't know what to treat for. But our options with large patch or brown patch are azoxystrobin, myclobutanil, and propiconazole. These are pretty common formulations you can find at lawn and garden stores, big box stores, Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart, those things, your spectricides, fungicides. The azoxystrobin you can get in granular or in a ready to spray mix. So again, if you do have these issues, if you preventative is the way to go. So if you know you have this commonly in a certain area of your yard where it kind of stays more wetter or doesn't drain quite as well, stays a little shadier, may be a good thing to put out prior to the onset of the conditions that these diseases like. Instead of waiting for them to show their ugly heads, you just go ahead and kind of get a jump start on them, put it out preventatively when the conditions, again, when the temperatures are around 80 during the day and cooler nights and heavy dews or humid and cloudy days. So that's kind of what feeds these turf grasses or these pathogens. Our next one is take all patch. This one is pretty common to St. Augustine. We see a little bit in centipede as well, but it's typically more of an issue with St. Augustine grass. It's one of its biggest culprits. Gray leaf spot is also another one. Take all root rot is another name for this, but take all patch, typically caused by wet conditions, and it's typically caused because of too much thatch. So dethatching is a form of preventative maintenance, just to limit that ability of that thatch to retain moisture and keep that leaf, that turf grass leaf blade from staying wet and just the ground being able to dry up. So removal of that thatch layer and preventing that thatch layer from ever building up is pretty key step in the management and prevention of this particular disease. So one thing you can do is use an acidifying fertilizer. These things, if your pH is a little high, causing a little bit of acidity in your turf or in your soil, since this is a soil-borne pathogen, can cause a little bit of help to help alleviate some of the issues. So just something to think about. So if you do use a fungicide, just remember that it is soil-borne. So just make sure you either water it in, or if you're using a granular or liquid, just kind of water it in to make sure it gets to where it needs to go. Just like an insecticide, where if the insect we're wanting to treat for is living in the ground, we need to make sure we water or irrigate our insecticide in to make sure we're getting that insecticide where it needs to be. Just leaving it sitting up on top of the turf grass leaves itself really ain't going to help too much. So, just remember that. Gray leaf spot. All right, this one is one I see a whole lot of on St. Augustine grass, mainly because it's St. Augustine grass that is growing in conditions that St. Augustine grass shouldn't be growing in. So a low pH, getting mowed at half an inch to an inch high, where St. Augustine not following proper mowing procedures, mowing heights, things like that. you will definitely run into issues with gray leaf spot when you're trying to grow this particular turf grass in conditions it doesn't like. Usually see it in high humidity, mostly in drought stress and high temperatures. So this is one of those that kind of likes the higher temperatures. Now, all of this is, again, kind of what it likes. It's not to say you won't ever see it outside of that, outside of those conditions, but that is when you see the majority of it causing an issue. As far as the take-all patch, as far as treatment, the azoxystrobin, I apologize, the azoxystrobin is one of your better options. Again, once the conditions change, you're not going to have that much of an issue with it. That's the good thing about these. And again, like I mentioned earlier, once the conditions change, a lot of times your grass will grow back this time of year. You got 3 to 4 or 5 months left of the growing season. So, these are more of an issue in the fall, going into winter time, when you're going to have to be looking at a mud spot or a dead spot for the next 5 to 6 months over the winter, or fall, late early winter. So again, I don't get too tied up over diseases in the spring, other than, if it's just getting to be terrible. But you do like to do say you did something. So thiophanate methyl and the azoxystrobin are two of your bigger and more well-known and available options for homeowners. Again, none of these are going to be cheap. That's the bad thing about fungicides, is they are relatively expensive to treat with. Just like any other really herbicides or insecticides, they're not the cheapest things in the world, but compared to insecticides, typically fungicides are a little more expensive to use. So I don't know why that's not showing up on all of these, or you can't read quite all of the letters there. I apologize for that. So the next one that I see a whole lot of, especially in new construction homes, new homes that have just been constructed past few years, or especially older homes that have had a lot of tree work done or trees removed, brushes removed, shrubs, things like that, is fairy ring. This is a very interesting disease. This is one that I have dealt with quite a bit on the golf course for various reasons. And there are 3 types of fairy rings. Type 1 is, as you see up in the top left corner, it creates a dead ring or a dead patch. And basically in that case, what has happened is that the fungi has infected the soil and has created it has made the soil hydrophobic, so it repels water. And then because of that, the grass within that area where it's been infected has died, is basically died from moisture stress. So to treat type 1, basically you just want to try to break down that hydrophobic layer using a pitchfork or something to water it heavy to kind of get water back into that system. Basically the grass will recover. But again, so type 2 is a little bit different. Type 2 fairy rings. This is one where you will just see kind of a lush green ring out in the grass. It doesn't kill anything. That's because the fungi hasn't made a hydrophobic layer, but it is breaking down the organic matter within that soil, and it is releasing nitrogen as it breaks down that organic matter, and that nitrogen is creating that darker ring spot or darker ring, and creating lush growth on your grass. So that's why it sticks out. Treatment of this one is something kind of along the same lines, but basically you just kind of want to either fertilize around that area or fertilize that area kind of in general to kind of make everything else as green as that is. So, you know, you're basically just masking the effects of it. You're not really treating the disease itself, because again, this is just something that you're going to see a couple times a year if you got it, and it typically affects the same areas over and over. And a little bit about this disease: it is the oldest, one of the oldest or earliest documented diseases in the world. The reason it got its name is because obviously these kind of show up overnight, and sometimes you do see the type 3 fairy ring with the little mushrooms around the edges of the green ring. So back in the day, apparently they used to think it was a fairy had come out and danced circles and left a ring in the ground, and those were their little stools that they all sat on, the mushrooms. So just kind of an interesting little tidbit. But typically see these where stuff has been buried, or like a tree has been cut down and you grind the stump and you put sod over where the stump used to be, and as that stump decays, you get this in that general area where it's feeding on that old breaking down lignin and stuff from the tree stump. But so chemical control, not very effective, but and it is very expensive. ProStar, which is flutolenil, I believe, is one of the few, along with the azoxystrobin again, that you're going to see kind of the same chemicals treated for all of these, or treatment recommended for most all of these. Azoxystrobin is a very good fungicide, works on a wide variety of different diseases and works on a wide variety of turf grasses. So again, just something to think about, whether or not you even want to treat at all, if it calls for treatment. So the control of fungal disease, a few things we need to do. We need to try to use resistant or tolerant cultivars. Again, there is some things like St. Augustine. There are some varieties that are resistant to St. Augustine decline, which is basically a viral disease. So that's really kind of your only option in the turf grass industry. Again, we don't really have the option of tomatoes where they got all these built-in resistance to all these different diseases. We don't really have that option and luxury here in the turf grass world, but we do have some. So just something to think about. We want to make sure that whenever we do have a disease, that we are we're removing that material, we're destroying that infected plant debris. So we're not just raking it up, leaving it in a pile. We're not leaving that hay. If we miss a mowing or two, we're not just leaving that hay piled up there on our turf grass to, you know, possibly cause some issues. Keep that moisture high within the canopy of the plant, shade that canopy, shade that plant out. So sanitation is a big thing, something huge to think about. Elimination of alternative hosts. Obviously, this is kind of limited as far as what we can do as well. This isn't a garden, so you know, horse nettle and things like that, you know, obviously we don't want that in our yard anyway, but there are some things we can do to help with that issue. But again, this is something that we're not totally in control of, because we can't ask our neighbors to quit planting whatever it is they have planted, or you know, or swap to a whole nother type of turf. A good fertilization schedule. So obviously avoid that early fertilization in the early spring when the disease environment is extremely ripe for the picking for the disease. So wait a little while on getting your, you know, putting your fertilizer out there. Not do it at the first sign of early spring green up, and don't put it out there late in the year either, when you're basically inviting that disease to come in late in the year when the conditions turn back right into fall with those cool nights, warm days, and high humidity or high moisture. So, and don't over fertilize either. Again, I see just as many issues, if not more, caused because of over fertilization than I do under fertilization. So just something to think about. A big one here. We talked a little bit about this last time on the establishment and maintenance, about how to properly irrigate. Talked about the amount being, put your irrigation or your sprinkler out there or run your irrigation system. Use the little cat food or the tuna cans as 1 inch kind of gauges and see how long, plan accordingly to that. Whether, you're looking for about 1 inch to 1.5 inches per week. So don't irrigate when you don't need to. Again, we like to recommend irrigate when the grass is already wet, either whether it be because of dew. So don't be out there, try to avoid watering in the middle of the day when you're going to lose it because of evaporation. And don't, as soon as the sun comes up or as soon as the dew dries off the grass, don't go out there and irrigate. Try to irrigate when the grass is already moist anyway because of dew or some other thing if possible. But again, I know that's not always the case. You're just trying to limit the amount of time that grass blade stays wet. So if the grass usually is wet from 12 at night once the dew sets to 9 o'clock in the morning when the sun dries it out, water sometime before 9 o'clock. Try to finish your watering prior to 9 a.m. Whenever that may be. So if it takes you 2 hours to water, you need to start around 7 in the morning. If it takes you 20 minutes, you can start at 8:30. But again, just something to think about. Again, removal and elimination of plant debris. And then fungicides. This is something that, again, I don't like to use a lot of fungicides on my lawn. A, because it's expensive. B, it works, but I'm still going to have lawn issues and lawn diseases in the end anyway. So if I can deal with it by just doing cultural practices like proper irrigation, removal of plant debris, things like that, that's what I'm going to try to do the best or try to do the most of. But if you are going to use fungicides, again, just as with any pesticide, always read and follow the label. You're going to find all the information you need within that label. If you can't find it, call your county extension office. We can, if you have something that you're not familiar with, or we can look at the label, we can pull them up typically and kind of let you know how to use it. Make sure you mix it according to the label. So if it says 5 ounces per gallon of water, 10 ounces ain't twice as good, unfortunately. But again, a couple of reasons to not do this. A, you're building up probably resistance issues. So, and B, economic sense. This stuff is, again, already expensive, and they've put the money into it and know that at that particular rate it works. So there's no sense in you trying to use 10 ounces when it only says 5. There's no twice as dead. Dead is dead. But all the instructions as far as mixing up, what diseases it will work on, whether it's labeled and can be used on your particular type of turf grass will all be found in the label. Make sure you use all the required recommended personal protective equipment, and remember that the label is the law. So you can run into some legal issues without following the law or without following the label. So just some things to think about. Again, typically we don't see very many fungicides that are labeled for particular turf grasses. Most fungicides are labeled for a wide range of turf grasses. If they're labeled for any, they're kind of labeled for all, unlike herbicides. But there are a couple that I say that, and there are a couple that are only safe for certain species of turf. So just be diligent, do your homework, and again, call your county extension office, or I can't say enough how the Establish and Manage Your Home Lawn publication, how well that publication is put together, and how thorough it is as far as charts and things to let you know which fungicides work well on what diseases and things like that. So always be sure to check out that, or go to the website and check out that publication if you don't have a physical copy. I'm going to kind of end it there.